Hi, I'm Dr. Richard Bolzachelli for Catholic Studies Academy. Today I'd like to talk a little bit about the term transubstantiation and what that term represents theologically. Any well-catechized Catholic should be familiar with this term because it's the word that we use to describe what happens in the consecration of the bread and the wine at the Mass. When the priest prays the words of institution, we believe, the bread and the wine cease to be bread and wine and become instead the body and blood of Christ. This is a mysterious thing, of course, and it's not without its difficulties. The theologian of the 11th century, Berengar of Tours, took issue with very literalist understandings of the consecration of the Eucharist. He thought that the prevailing view was too carnal. And he thought that when I look at the consecrated elements, I don't see flesh and blood. I see bread. I taste bread. I smell bread. It feels like bread. There's nothing about it that seems anything at all like flesh and blood. So how could it be that this really is the flesh and blood of Christ? That was too simple an explanation, he thought. And so he proposed more spiritualized views of what it means to say that Christ is bodily present, truly present in the Eucharist. Berengar was proposing a view that ultimately would have been adopted by someone like John Calvin. It's not absolutely a rejection of the true presence, but it's a rejection of what Catholics have seen as essential to the doctrine of the true presence. At issue here isn't that we're supposed to imagine that the Eucharist looks and feels and tastes and smells anything at all like flesh and blood after the consecration. No Catholic believes that except in some occasional Eucharistic miracle where that has occurred. But in virtually every experience that every Catholic has throughout the course of his life of going to the Eucharistic liturgy, it still looks and tastes and feels and smells just like bread and wine. No one's really denying this. But of course that requires some kind of account, right? The term transubstantiation is used to tell us that this isn't bread and wine anymore, in spite of what it may appear to be. So we hold that the qualitative dimension of bread and wine remains, what we would call the accidents, the accidental characteristics, how big it is, how much it weighs, what it smells like, what it tastes like, what it looks like, what it feels like. All of these things remain from the bread and the wine, but the bread and the wine cease to be. Instead, there is flesh and blood of Christ. Now, without the accidents of flesh and blood, but instead those of bread and wine. This is not really an explanation. It's just a description of what occurs. There is no actual explanation for this. It's a miracle that happens every time the liturgy is celebrated. But in the 11th century, during the time of Berengar, this term transubstantiation was advanced as a way of saying this. And in the Fourth Lateran Council, 1215, that term was sort of doctrinally enshrined. Now, this isn't to say that the Church insists that this is the only term that can be used to identify the dogmatic content of the faith regarding the Eucharist, but the Church has settled on this term in the absence of any better term. Questions still remain, of course, right? St. Thomas noticed, right, the same thing that Berengar noticed, and he asked the question of, like, is Christ present as if in a place? He said, no, Christ isn't really present as if in a place. Does that mean he's not bodily present? This is an interesting issue. He goes on to ask, well, what about annihilation? Do the bread and the wine simply cease to be? Again, he answers the question, no. And what about consubstantiation, the idea that the bread and the wine are still present, but Christ is now also present? he rejects this view as well. The Church has actually rejected the idea of consubstantiation, right? That the bread and the wine are present together with the body and blood of Christ. Has rejected this view because what it is that we're actually eating in the Eucharist has to be Jesus Christ, flesh and blood, body, blood, soul, and divinity. Why? Because going back to the Gospel of St. John, and as that Gospel was interpreted by Ignatius of Antioch and the Apostolic Fathers in general, the view was that flesh and blood union with Jesus Christ, who is the source of life, and by that life rises from the dead, that this is the source of the resurrection, that it's Christ who, as the living one, rises from the dead in the nature in which he became incarnate. It's his flesh and blood that rises from the dead. And so our union with that flesh and blood, our presence in Christ Jesus, is the cause of our own resurrection. So this is the mystery that the Church is trying to preserve. It's interesting now that Aquinas rejects the idea that the bread and the wine that had been there before are annihilated, while also rejecting consubstantiation for the reasons I've just explained, and saying that Christ isn't present as if in a place. He's not, because we look around and we see this and that in the liturgy, everyone receiving the Eucharist, wafer after wafer, right? How could he be in all these places all at one time? That's not how being in a place works. What's interesting is this. Thomas's explanation basically leads us to this point, that the bread and the wine aren't annihilated, they're taken up, completely brought into oneness with Jesus Christ. They cease to be anything other than Jesus Christ. They become instead the passageway through which we travel to enter into him ourselves. Christ isn't present as if in a place in the consecrated Eucharist. Rather, that place that had been occupied by bread and wine is now in Jesus Christ. This is the nature of the mystery of transubstantiation. And one can see why, as imperfect a term as this may be, it is nonetheless rather useful theologically. And it takes us a pretty good way to understanding what's really at stake in this great mystery.